Now we're going to discuss playback modes on video. And in order to do so, I have created a regular full HD screen and I've imported the Coet picture sequence, which we have already used in one of the previous explanation videos. Now, before we start with playback modes, I would like to discuss the inspector options and the fields you can use in here in order to modify your media. Time, of course, describes where the clip starts. If you go up and down in here, as you can see, the position here on our video also changes. I could, again, of course, work with mathematical functions in here, so plus 200. Again, in order to add 2 seconds and 0 frames, or I put just the values in here by hand in order to get to my desired destination. Duration, of course, determines the duration of the video, and again, all here is cross-selected. So if I do my changes in here, they will also change right here in the inspector. Same again with mathematical functions. So let's add 5 seconds, and here we go. Now, if I want to get back to my standard video length, what I can do is on right click, we can find some more options. There is size to resource resolution, which will resize the video to standard length. Size to resource duration, not resource solution. Then there is add pause cue before clip, which can come in handy if you want to add a simple pause cue before the clip starts. And there is show resource in the project, which will, let's quickly close this up, open this and show it in here. And there's close time gap to preceding clips and now pointer, which will simply close the time gap to the now pointer, should be before, like this, for example. Now, talking about playback modes, you can find them here in the inspector. The standard default is locked to time. That's just regular playback. When you play back the clip, the video is actually playing back. If you pause, of course, the video will pause too. So it basically follows the timeline. It's locked to the timeline. Then there is free play once, which will basically free play the clip. You can do in the meantime everything you want to do on your timeline. You can start and edit on your timeline, for example. And once it hits the last frame, it will keep the last frame. So let's take a look at this maybe with a shorter video. This is only 10 seconds long. Now let's go here to free play once. It will now play back the clip. And once the video hits the last frame, there we go. It just simply keeps the last frame. And then there's free loop, which will basically loop the video all the way, all the time, as you can see. Below the play modes, you can find in and out point settings. With in and out points, you can define custom in and out points. So I can tell, for example, Pixera, I want to loop from 2 to 3 seconds, which will now loop the video only from 2 to 3 seconds. This mode, of course, also works with all the play modes you can see above in here in these options. And last but not least, there's show in point, which will basically show the in point of the which will show the frame of the in point which you have added in here. Of course, I should also add the out point duration. Now we can change the in point and go also up and down. As you can see, I can now scrub in here and look for the frame I want to keep, and now it will be a still image of that frame. So let's go back to 100 to 500, so from 1 second to 5 seconds, and loop this again. So we can take a look at playback speed. With playback speed, you can, of course, change the playback speed to make the video faster. And it's also possible in here to go minus speed in order to reverse playback content, as you can see. Below you find your blend options. So this is basically the frame blender. In the case or in cases where you have videos which don't match your output FPS or your project's FPS, the frame blender will simply help and add additional frames to make the video smoother. It is activated by default, as you can see. If you don't want to activate it, you can just simply click here on this button in order to activate and deactivate the frame blending mechanism. The next topic I would like to discuss are transport modes on your layers for your content. Now, we've already discussed the regular transport modes, which let you influence the content's playback types and playback modes. Additionally to that, you also have accessibility to transport controls on the timeline, which you can find by simply expanding the layer. They hide here on the top, at top of your regular keyframes. Now, you can actually expand this a little bit further down here in order to get some more options, as you can see. But you don't really need those because they will also be accessible in your inspector. So how does this work? You can in here add keyframes, similar to adding keyframes on your regular position, rotation, and size controls. And with those keyframes, you can influence the playback on a clip base. So once I have created this keyframe, I can now here my inspector change some of the settings. Of course, I can change the time. As you can see, as I change this, again, the keyframe position will change. I can change the mode. I can change from play, pause, and stop. I can set it to loop. I can set in and out points, and I can set speed. What's important to know here is that playback modes don't work in free run. So the video has to be in standard playback, lock to time, no free run. Now let's take a look. What I will do now is I will now set a pause, and let's start the playback. So the video plays back, and once it hits the keyframe, it pauses, as you can see. Now, this command here, I could also send in here or trigger with my controls, which you can find over here. So I could basically press here play now. As you can see, it overrides now the current playback mode and plays the video, and I can now set the keyframe by pressing this yellow button. This will lead to a pause and afterwards a play again. Now, additionally to that, I can also set up loops. So what I could do, for example, I could set now a play with a loop and change my in and out point. For example, I want to loop from 1 second to 2 seconds. And additionally to that, oh, that's the wrong one. I want to add another keyframe. There we go. Loop from 1 second to 2 seconds. And I want to also increase the speed. So I want to go 2 times the speed. So what the media will do now is it will pause. If I set it to pause, there we go. It will pause, play, jump back and loop from 1 to 2 seconds. And then, for example, I could again add a pause button with my controls in here. Next, we're going to talk about cues. And before we do that, I would like to give you a brief overview about our timeline options right here, as a lot of them are used in order to place cues. So the first and second one we already discussed. That's just regular scaling and layer height. With this I changed my layer height. Then in here you can scroll to now pointer. So if your now pointer is off, our now pointer is detached from the timeline because we have let's call it online editing. You can edit while you still have the show running. With this you can scroll to the now pointer. So let's place this back to 0 and there we go. And this one will follow the now pointer. So let's zoom in here and let's activate that. That's a toggle. Let's zoom in even further. And as you can see, now the timeline will jump with, or the timeline part that's shown will jump when the now pointer actually leaves. There you go. Now, the next shortcuts here on our timeline are all used for cues. The first one is toggle next cue states, jump to next cue, add play cue, add pause cue, add stop cue, and add jump cue. We're going to discuss them in some minutes. This one we already know, just as a layer, and in here we can add time. So let's bring the locator up here, and if I now put this in here, I could add, for example, 5 seconds, 500, and after the file now, as you can see, a 5-second gap will be added. Let's go back for now. The next icon is the cut tool, and by toggling this, that's again a toggle, once you, let's bring the layer height up a little bit, once you put your mouse on top of a container, you can see this tool, and this will allow you to cut your media. So I can now click in here, and now if I click a second time, it will perform a clean cut. There you go. What I could also do on the other hand is click once and then Alt and drag. So I hold the Alt button and now drag it back and forth in order to change the in point, as you can see. So this basically is changed to 5 seconds. As you can see, the in point, not 5, it was 6 seconds, is now set to 6 seconds. Let's go back. This icon we also know, join kinds. Then there is lock movement to vertical axis. Now, as you can see, I cannot move horizontal, I can only move vertical. That's also really important when working with keyframes. Let's quickly add a keyframe here. As you can see, now I can only go up and down, not left and right. And this locks it horizontally. Now I can only do horizontal movement, as you can see. Also here on the clips, I cannot go up and down. And last but not least, preview, edit, and export timelines, which we'll discuss in some later stages. Now let's get back to cues. This front part here or this top part here on the timeline is reserved for cues. You can add cues by simply double clicking in here, which will then create a play cue. You can then see all of the cue's abilities in the inspector. If you want to place a cue before a clip, so let's say I want to add a pause in here, so let's change this to pause. If you snap it like this, it will always put the keyframe at the first frame of the clip. If you want to set the cue before the clip, I would recommend to, for example, let's select all of these, right click and add pause cue before clip, which will then add the pause cue right before the clip. Now let's get back to the inspector. As you can see, operation wise, we have play, pause, stop, and jump. Play is just a regular play cue. It doesn't do a lot. However, you can trigger additional commands with this play cue. If you don't want to add cues by double clicking in here, you can also add them by executing it here on the top. So I can add a play cue here, a pause, a stop, as well as a jump cue. Now, let's take a look at some more options in here. Let's, for example, add a jump cue. Now, on a jump cue, I can choose in the mode section between to time and to label. To time just lets me import a time. Let's put in 2 minutes. There we go. Now, as I now hit this queue, it will, of course, jump to 2 minutes. Sorry. Besides to time, I can also choose to label. And by doing so, I can, let's create another queue and label this jump. Come on. There we go. And I can now choose, instead of a time, my goal, my label goal. And I could, for example, also add a blend duration to this. So I can put in here 2 seconds of blend duration. And now once I execute this jump, as you can see, it will execute with a blend. You can also see it here on the locator. It turns blue for 2 seconds, which indicates that the actual jump is being executed with a fade. Now, the play queue has a special option, which is called wait duration. And by utilizing wait duration, you can just simply add a wait to a queue. You see it on the clock here. Now, you can also see this here on our timeline time indicators. So the first one is always the regular timeline time. The second one is always the time up to the next queue. Now for the wait duration, there is also another indication right here. So I now hit the time or the queue. As you can see, it turns orange, which indicates I have a wait duration in here, and then it advances with regular playback. The last queue we're missing is a stop queue, and stop will bring the timeline back to 0. Always keep in mind, play, pause, and stop in Pixara works similar to an old tape recorder, you know, from tapes. Play is always play, pause is pause, and stop is back to 0. It's not to deactivate the timeline, it's really to go back to 0. Which, of course, when running multiple timelines, draws resources if you have media in the beginning. And of course, it will also be shown. So that's something you should always keep in mind. Last but not least, it's also possible in your queues to trigger network commands directly. So you could, if you want to send data, network commands out of your queues, assign an API output in here, and even launch a script editor. And you could, for example, implement JavaScript in here in order to send JavaScript directly out of the queue without any additional software needed in here. All of these queues are also, of course, available through Pixara's API and also through Avio. So if you want to do Avio show control installation, of course, all of these will be accessible for you. Now let's start and combine our queue system with our different playback modes. So what I've done here is I have set my first video to free run. And as you can see, I can now use the locator completely free and do whatever I want. Video still plays back. Now with this button here on top, I can now jump to the next queue, as you can see, which won't interrupt any of the playback as it's running in free play. Now let's do a jump to our next clip. You can see right here, we've got the jump queue, same as before, with 2 seconds of blend duration. So we jump with a soft blend, and again, we are here in pause, and our video is running in free loop. Now let's take a look at our last function here, which is toggle next queue state, active ignore. And if I activate this, as you can see, the next queue is going to be red. So it will be ignored on the run through. So as we're approaching the queue and hitting it, as you can see, nothing was actually executed. The queue's operation wasn't executed as it was ignored because of this option.